Greetings and welcome to another Warhammer Underworlds tactics video. Today I'll be going over deck building for Warhammer Underworlds. Now this is another tactics video based on the success of my board, objective and lethal hex placement video. And yeah, based on that I've decided to make more tactics videos just to help people out. Now as always, I'll try and make this an evergreen video because I try and make everything I write or record something you can always reference to depending on when you're listening to it or watching it or reading it. Now, because of the ever-changing nature of the game, I'll just be basing it on what we have at the moment in Diachasm, but it will vary depending on what game mode or when you're playing, but I'll cover that more when we get to it in the video. And as always, this is probably going to be quite long, but it's, as always, a thorough explanation of how I approach deck building to, make it translate well to you, so you get a fair idea of how deck building is done for a competitive player, such as myself. But it's also useful even if you're not that competitive. It just goes over how deep deck construction can be and how thoroughly you can approach it. But as always, there'll be timestamps in the episode description navigating each section and, making it easier for you to navigate if you want to skip to certain parts or watch back after watching the whole video. And as always, please remember to like and subscribe, as well as comment as to what you thought of today's video and what other things you'd like me to talk about for Warhammer Underworlds tactics. I have a lot of videos planned on the subject, but I'm always keen and happy to hear what people want me to talk about because, the main reason I started making Warhammer Underworlds content in general is to help people and share my knowledge. So just let me know in the episode description below. So without further ado, let's get on with today's video for deck building. Deck building is an important part of Warhammer Underworlds because it helps determine how you operate and play in order to win based on your objective deck, as well as how your Warband operates in terms of combos, rules, interactions, and resilience based on the power deck. If you take a selection of cards with no solid theme or goal, it can often lead to failure and highly inefficient play. As a general rule, I'll be focusing on the current championship format rules for deck construction, which is 12 objectives with a maximum of 6 surge objectives, and then a 20 card power deck with a minimum of 10 upgrades. Now this may vary based on what season you're playing, because for example, if you're playing older seasons, Diachasm is the only season which actually specifically states you need to have a maximum of 6 surges, whereas older seasons don't. Or if you're playing Relic format, which needs 15 objectives instead of the maximum of 12. So when it comes to deck building itself, I highly recommend you use a deck builder. You can use just cards and pen and paper, but that's really long and it's difficult to save what you've written. So I find deck builders are the best because you can do it quickly and save and just build multiple decks with them. Now there are multiple deck builders out there, but I highly recommend Underworlds DB. Now it isn't exactly too friendly to new beginners, but once you get the hang of it and know, the basics of Warhammer Underworlds, you can quickly build decks that are clear and easy to follow, and you have the options of just having card images or text and, card names. And then you can it quickly shows you what decks are legal. You can make an account for the website, so you can do decks over both computer and mobile, so you can have them in multiple places, but still have one main source. And then you can do them for different play formats, such as Warhammer Underworlds Online, exporting to Tabletop Simulator, or even, just standard championship format play. It'll even show you what cards are popular for the deck and warband you're trying to make. And it also shows tournament decks. So it's just a highly useful deck building tool and the gold standard for me when it comes to deck builders. Now you also have the option to net deck. And while I am not a big fan of it, I did use it to an extent when I first started out and still do to this day. But the reason I don't use net decking is because when you just try net decking is when you take someone's deck online and just use it or make minor tweaks to it. Now, the problem is, even though you may have the best understanding of Warhammer Underworlds, you won't know how that deck works unless someone explains it to you. So if you're just trying to copy someone's deck, you don't really understand why they're trying to play it or how they're trying to play it and how the cards interact, as well as what they're trying to do with it with that warband. So you can end up with a situation where you're going, I'm using this top tier deck that's won tournaments, but I'm not winning. So that's why I use it as a reference tool. Because when I started out in Shadespire, there was this big discussion of like, everyone should do holds objectives 1 to 5. But then you look at the decks that were doing well, and none of them were doing that. So I looked at those decks, and I didn't copy how to build from them. I used them as a building point and a referencing point for deck building. So that's what I think is best when it comes to decks you find online. Not copying them, but using them as a referencing tool. Now, another thing to keep in mind is also that you know the general archetypal playstyles for Warhammer Underworlds. I've done an article on this, which you can find in the episode description below, but basically you need to understand the main key concepts of aggro, hold objective, control, and flex. Then you also have magic, and to a lesser degree since Beastgrave and to an extent Diachasm, you have hunter decks, quarry decks, hunger decks, and primacy decks. But mainly I'll be covering the 4 core deck building archetypes, which are, playstyle archetypes, which are aggro, hold objective, control, and flex. So, aggro is being aggressive, hold objectives is holding objectives, control is either controlling someone's movement or turtle control, sitting at the back of the board drawing cards, and then you have flex, which is a combination of 2 or more playstyles. So yeah, you just need to keep an idea of those key concepts when you approach deck building, and you should be fine. So for choosing your warband and playstyle, when I approach deck building, I first look at their warband and their characteristics on their fighter cards. After evaluating them from their keywords, special rules, ability, and inspiring condition as what they gain from inspiring, I then set on what playstyle I want to use them for. So viewing a warband and their fighter cards first before going with the playstyle is how I approach it and how I find it's best. Because if you go off of the warband you want to run first, then the playstyle, it synergizes more. Because if you like the warband and realize they don't suit the playstyle you want to play, then you can just swap it around in terms of the warband and find a warband that better suits the playstyle you want to go with. Now, one of the greatest things about Warhammer Underworlds is to remember that a warband can be run in any playstyle you want. They may not be able to do it exceedingly well, but they can generally play any playstyle. This is important, so you shouldn't feel constrained when you approach deck building with a warband. You shouldn't feel like you have to run it the way everyone else is running it because that's what's popular and successful at the moment. It may just be no one's figured out that build yet. For example, running like an aggro deck as aggro warband in a more hold objective playstyle. There's nothing wrong with that, and experimentation is key. So when you approach deck building, try not to be kept back by that kind of idea, like this warband has to be played this way. Unless it's something like where a warband can't do a particular playstyle, like with Moloch, because he's really only model in the warband that can hold an objective. So hold objective playstyle doesn't really work with that warband, but that's more of an exception instead of the general rule. So one example I want to use when it comes to not being swayed by going with the popular flow of what people are generally using is Spikeclaw's Swarm. So this was a warband I used a lot at Shadespire. And when they first came out, everyone was going with their hold objective keep away build because they had movement 5, decent defense, and they could get anywhere on the board. So they were very difficult to pin down, but people were using them as a keep away warband to sit on objectives with keys. And they'd also won a Grand Clash with that build, which helped push that as the main way to play them. But because I'm from London and we all play aggro down here, I looked at the warband and noticed they were actually quite accurate with Scritch and Kirk. And then when inspired, Scritch goes to 3 damage. Now he has an innate ability that when he rolls a crit, he gets cleave, which is kind of useless except against multi-defense fighters. But even then, that's 3 damage. And the entire warband is movement 5 with minimum 1 range, which puts them all at 6 hex threat range. With Scritch, he has a threat range of 7 hexes. And if you put him in the second or even third front row of the board, he can hit any enemy fighter anywhere on the board. And one of the popular builds were Turtle Steelheart's Champions. So what would happen is people could realize, well, they'd realize mid-game they couldn't actually hide from Scritch. And it was very easy to get Scritch to 4, even 5 damage. So once you're in that range, people were just like cracking under pressure. And even the other Skaven fighters, even though their attack actions were quite weak, they all went to 2 dodge when inspired. So if you put weapon attack action upgrades on them like Shadeglass Hammer and Dagger, they could pump anywhere from 3 to 4 damage. So I had all this massive threat and all this movement, and people weren't really running it. Some people did, but not to much success. And then after a few weeks and months of fine-tuning, I managed to make it pretty unbeatable. But the main thing here is going against the flow, because I would run into these hold objective Skaven decks and they were just shocked I was beating them. But it was partly because they realized they couldn't run away. And that's just that huge impact of running a warband in the way people wouldn't expect, because people generally look like, oh, you know, they don't have that much damage, they're 2 card reliant, they only got 2 wounds, but then they've got this precision inspire ability and multiple defense dice characteristics. So it kind of offsets them being quite low wounded. And then you can even bring fighters back with Scritch. So with minimal investment, you could make this warband a super oppressive aggro threat. Now, was it more difficult to play than the hold objective build? Yes, but it was also more rewarding. But this is a kind of example I want you to think about when you look at a warband. Don't just always be swayed by the characteristics up front and the popularity of what people are commonly using with them. So for this video, I'm going to use the Starblood Stalkers from Diachasm. I did consider using the starter set warbands or one of the older warbands, but the starter set warbands are a little bit difficult and contentious when it comes to Dreppers Wraith Creepers, but also the older warbands are quite difficult to get because they're not in production anymore unless they're Beastgrave warbands, and at least Diachasm is the current season, plus I think this warband would be a good talking point. So, I look at the fighter cards first, and generally the warband is a horde/swarm warband because you have 6 fighters, and a lot of the fighters are on 2 to 3 wounds. Your leader is 3 wounds, but then half of the warband defends on dodges, whereas half defends on block symbols. Now, a key thing which I like to point out is I look at the warband's characteristics, keywords, abilities, inspire condition. And the cool thing about this warband, which I can see already, they're all movement 4, and they have a lot of range 2 and 3 attack actions. So I have a lot of threat range with this warband, meaning I don't need to always rely on mobility cards heavily to get where I need to go. Now, off of this, you can see that, well, all the skinks have the skink keywords. Otter has the hunter and quarry keywords, which is really useful when it comes to the quarry keywords. And then the rest of the skinks have the hunter keywords. Now, another thing to point out is Clacktrock is basically its own individual beast. The inspire condition of the warband is after an activation if you have 3 or more objectives, whereas Clacktrock inspires after a successful attack action. Clacktrock also has a powerful jaws and a reaction ability that lets it, after its activation, make the powerful jaws ability. Some things you have to remember are powerful jaws can't be modified, so you can't increase its dice or damage, but you can use it after this fighter's activation. So you could move Clacktrock or go on guard with Clacktrock and then react. But generally you'll be attacking with the Celestite Warmaul and then powerful jaws. For the inspire ability in general, the warband is actually pretty easy to inspire and it's very controlled because you always have the choice to move onto that 3rd objective. Now, when you have 3 objectives in your half, it's very easy, but even when you have only 2, with the warband's high movement, it should be fairly easy to get that 3rd objective. But the important thing is here, I can control the inspire condition very well, because when you look at other warbands, sometimes it's only after a successful attack, or taking damage, or making a successful defense roll, or another condition at the end of the round. So it's very fluid, and I have a lot of control, which is something I like when it comes to warbands. Now, after this quick glance, one thing I want to do is run this warband as an aggro warband. But I do know they have a lot of hold objective abilities and benefits. Now, this is because they're a 6-fighter warband and are fast, but all the skinks, apart from Otter and your leader, have the ability Skittish, which allows after an opponent's power step to push this fighter 1 hex away from an enemy fighter within 2 hexes. So you could use this to position onto an objective, for example. And then you have Otter Paddle, which can, even though, I love Otter Paddle because it hits on crits like, but it's Cleave and Snare, range 3, 3 crits, damage 1, but on a successful attack, it can't drive back but gives the target a move token, which is really good. And it starts off at 2 dodge. But even for that aggro element, I can charge in with another fighter and then use Otter Paddle to get, farm for supports to get a lot of accuracy and more damage off. But even then, Kizitaka and Huachi have fairly solid attack action characteristics with 2 smash, 2 damage, and Kizitaka has a decent range 3 attack, but he also has an action which allows it to pick a feature token within 3 hexes. Then you either flip it or deal 1 damage to an enemy fighter within 1 hex of that, and that can only be done once per round. So there's a lot of stuff going on. But if we look at the inspired side, the Warband actually doesn't get too much from inspiring. If you look at Kizitaka, it only gets 1 dice to its Starbolt, so it goes to 3 smash from 2. Doesn't get any more wounds or movement, so Kizitaka basically starts inspired. Otter Paddle goes to 3 dodge from 2 and goes to 2 damage from 1, making it actually really important to get Otter Paddle inspired to get maximum usage out of it. Huachi doesn't really gain much either, but the most of the skinks, Tok gains the most going to 2 dodge. It does get 1 dice on its Moonstone Club, but you're mainly looking for that 2 dodge. Zepik goes from 2 Fury 1 damage to 3 Fury 2 damage, but generally that's not much from inspiring. The interesting point here is Clacktrock. Clacktrock basically operates as an independent unit. Its inspire condition is making a successful attack action. So an interesting thing you can do is attack with the Celestite Warm Wall, and if that succeeds, you can make an inspired attack with the powerful jaws, because you would inspire, then you would do the reaction, because the inspire condition is during an activation. So something of note is you can buff the Celestite Warm Wall to make sure you can get a 2 dice powerful jaws attack. Just something to note. But Clacktrock gains so much from inspiring from +1 move and +1 defense, so it goes to movement 4 and 2 block, which is huge. But from there, I can establish that the Warband's got a lot of potential, and it can do aggro pretty well, even uninspired. And the only fighter I'd really want inspired is Clacktrock and Otter Paddle, and maybe Tok for defensive purposes. So if I don't inspire, it's not a huge loss. Now, when it comes to the deck building itself, I actually don't recommend focusing on the faction cards first. I kind of memorize everything because of my reviews, so I have a fair idea. But the way when I approach deck building is I go objectives first, then gambits, then upgrades, because it's kind of a stepladder effect. Your objectives support what you want to do, in this case aggro and hold objective. Your gambits help support your objectives, and so do your upgrades. So it's kind of best to start off with the foundation of the objectives. Now, as already established, because the Warband has very good aggro potential and the ability to stay on objectives, I want to run a flex deck, which is aggro and hold objectives. So for the first objective I've picked, it's balance the cosmic equation. This is a hybrid that I score in the end phase if I either have 2 or more enemy fighters out of action, or I hold the most objectives, which supports both playstyles, because I can either get that while being aggressive or trying to hold objectives. Because the cool thing about aggro is it has a lot of glory gain, but if you're missing, you need something to fall back on, which is why I want the hold objective element. And hold objectives give me a lot of glory, because usually hold objective cards give you a lot of glory, which offsets my Warband being 6 fighters. So I'm building redundancy for both my Warband size and the weakness of aggro, while still capitalizing on both. So I've already started sorting it out already, so I'll go through the faction cards first, then universals. That's how I generally approach deck building. So I've already added the balance, the cosmic equation, and then next I'll look for something else that supports the Warband and my playstyles. My second objective will be Instinctive Tactics. So this is a card which is a surge you score after resolving your Warband's second or subsequent reaction in the same phase. So you have Scurry and you have the powerful Jaws reaction. So the cool thing you can do is the powerful Jaws reaction is always guaranteed, because no matter when you charge Clacktrock, unless you're charging a fighter with 3 or less wounds, you're always going to be able to react. So if I can get a Skittish off first, that's 1 reaction, so then I can immediately just charge in Clacktrock and get this for free. It's really good and synergizes what the Warband wants to do, whether I'm being aggressive or using hold objectives. But I can also take cards which grant reactions to help support this, because it says your Warband, not your fighters. Next is the Great Plan, which is probably the best faction objective in the game, or top 3 at least. So this is a dual objective which you score in the end phase if you have scored 6 or more objectives, and out of those 6 objectives, there are at least 1 surge, 1 dual, and 1 hybrid. Now for free glory, this is amazing, and you can also score in any end phase. So if you had an amazing turn 1, you could potentially score this in turn 1, although it'd be highly unlikely. You would have to basically score 5 or 6 surges, But the potential to score this earlier than the final end phase can put you on a massive glory train, and it's also really hard for your opponent to stop if you build your deck well. It's like Superior Tactician, but just better. So the next card is Will of the Slan, which you score in the end phase for 2 glory if you hold 1 or more objectives in 2 or more player territories. So 1 in enemy territory and 1 in my own. And, well, I'm going to be aggressive, so I'm going to be in my opponent's face, and generally I want to be on objectives. So this is actually really good, and it's 2 glory, which once again helps offset my Warband being 6 fighters. So because this is a championship format deck, I've got my Beastgrave cards, so I'm going to use some of those. So first, I'm going to use Absolute Stillness, because it's 2 glory for having a quarry holding an objective while that fighter has no move or charge tokens. So the cool thing, I have Otterpaddle, which is already a quarry innately, so if I can get Otterpaddle on an objective, without moving them or charging them, that's 2 glory, which is really good. And then there's cards I can take which makes other fighters quarries, so I can build redundancy into this and use Skittish as well to score this. This is more difficult, but it's also easier with the Starblood Stalkers because they have an innate quarry. The next card is Gathered Momentum. So with decks, you only generally can have 6 surges, but it can vary depending on your format you're playing in, but I always say run as many surges as you're allowed to, because surges are pretty broken, especially when they're really easy to score, because they're fast objectives that let you mill through your deck and gain early momentum. So Gathered Momentum is a surge and hybrid, so you either score it after you've scored your second or subsequent surge objective in that phase, or a fighter makes a charge action that traveled 5 or more hexes away from where they started. So I can either score this by just scoring surges or charging really fast. And the thing is, my Warband inspires to movement 5, so I don't even need to fill my deck with many mobility cards to score this. Really easy. Next then is just Hidden Purpose, which is another surge for holding 2 or more objectives. And it's just easy glory. It is a restricted card, so if you're playing championship format, you can only have 3 restricted cards in a deck, which is something to keep in mind. But this is a really simple objective for this Warband, which helps offset once again my 6 fighters, but allows me to get going quickly. And then for another surge, I have Swift Capture. It's like Will of the Slan, but as a surge instead of an end phase. It's also a duel, so I need to score this after an activation if I have fighters controlling objectives in my own territory and enemy territory. So I just need to be on 2 objectives. So if I'm already on 2 objectives in my own territory, I can run into a third in enemy territory, inspire, and then also get a glory out of it. So, and it helps me score Will of the Slan because, I want to score Swift Capture. So Will of the Slan is like, if you're doing that, you're going to get 2 glory out of that as well. So that's basically free glory for holding an objective in enemy territory. Next is Bold Conquest. So this is from the gift pack from Beastgrave, and it's a surge and duel objective where you score it after an activation where your leader made a charge action and they are holding an objective. So this is really good because Kizzy has a range 2 and range 3 attack action. So with movement 4, I can charge onto any objective and theoretically just, even if I miss, I'm still getting 1 glory. And because it's a duel, you have to keep in mind for the Great Plan, it helps my deck score the Great Plan faster. But it's also just really easy glory for this Warband because my leader isn't really the killiest of fighters, and it lets me, just score easy glory for holding objectives while still being aggressive. Next, I've added Clean Kills. Now, this is probably my favorite card they've added into Diachasm because of how balanced it is. It's the dual objective, which helps towards the Great Plan, but you score it in an end phase if fighters with a combined characteristic of 6 or more are out of action and no enemy fighter has wound counters. So your enemy can play around this by wounding their own fighters, but then it makes it easier for you to kill them. And the cool thing is, if you just kill 2 fighters, or you can generally score this, because, you know, if I killed 3 2-wound fighters, I've scored this, or if I killed a 4-wound fighter and a 2-wound fighter, I've scored this. So off of 2 kills, I can get 2 glory, which is very efficient, and as I said, it's a duel. So next is Dominant Position, which is probably the best hold objective in Diachasm and Beastgrave. Just 2 glory for holding more objectives than my opponent. So I can score this if I'm on 1 objective and my opponent is on none, or if I'm on 2, or even 3. As long as I have more than my opponent, I'm getting 2 glory, which is pretty easy at the moment considering hold objectives isn't that popular. And when I'm being aggressive, I can also force my opponent off objectives by just attacking and killing them. So it really helps support my aggro and hold objective playstyle at the same time. Now another card I've added is Fleeting Primacy from Diachasm. It's a Surge and Hybrid, so I score it by either having 3 or more objectives, or holding 3 or more objectives, or I hold 2 or more in enemy territory and have the Primacy token. So I unlock Primacy with this, but I'm mainly playing it for the first condition because, you know, if I Inspire, I get free glory. So what's not to love? It's not as good as Temporary Victory, but it is unrestricted. Next, I have Everything to Prove. So this is a Surge and Hybrid, and I score it if my opponent has the Primacy token after an activation, or I have a Quarry and I have the Primacy token. So I've got Otter Paddle, and I'm probably going to put some more Quarry cards in here, but then if my opponent kills a fighter, I get a glory immediately, and it also helps, you know, towards the Great Plan again. So an essential add to this deck. Another card I've added is Underdog, because once again, my Warband gives the Primacy away really easily. And if you're not aware, Primacy is when you kill an enemy fighter with no wound tokens, or you kill an enemy leader, or you have the most objectives, or you have a card that gives the Primacy token. So as of Diachasm, everyone's playing Primacy, and this is an objective I score if my opponent has the Primacy token, or they've scored 3 or more objectives than me. And for 2 glory, this is pretty awesome, because I can basically give away the Primacy, but then get 2 glory out of it, and then once again it goes towards the Great Plan. And as an end phase, it's super important, and 2 glory, so pretty much essential for any Swarm and Horde Warband. And then I've added Great Gains, because that's a personal favourite of mine. This Warband scores, this build scores a lot of glory quite quickly, and if I score 5 or more in a round, I get 2 glory out of that. So it's a win more card, but if you're building your deck right, your opponent can't stop it. And the way you score in the end phase is you choose how cards are scored. So I could leave Great Gains for last and then score into it. And then another card I've added is Path to Victory. If I control 2 or more objectives and a Warband, enemy fighter was taken out of action during that action phase. So it's 2 glory, it's a duel, and it's complementing what I want to do while being aggressive and holding objectives. So it's a pretty essential add. An interesting note of thing here is now I've gone way over the limit because you can only have 12 objectives in your objective deck and 6 has to be surges. But at the moment I have 7 surges and 9 end phases. But you may go, well, why did you do that? And that's the cool thing. I don't mind adding more than what you should have because then I can trim. And it's better having more choice than getting to this stage and going, damn, I only have like 11 objectives or 10. Now I have a solid idea. I can trim and find out what I think would be the easiest to score. So going through this, one key thing to keep in mind, my objective deck is kind of built around the Great Plan. So I need to keep in mind my dual and hybrid objectives. So at the moment, Underworlds DB points this out. So I have 5 hybrid objectives and 6 duels. So I generally want to keep that at least at 4. So let's look at these surges first because I have 7 and I think I already know what surge I want to prune. So even though Fleeting Primacy, let me go find it, is really good, 3 objectives for 1 glory, getting that 3rd objective may become problematic. I've already got Hidden Purpose, which is control 2 objectives for 1, and Everything to Prove is far easier for me. So I think I'll get rid of Fleeting Primacy, because even then, for my surges, I'll still have Everything to Prove, which is a hybrid. I will have Bold Conquest, which is a duel, Hidden Purpose, which is another surge, and Swift Capture. So I'll still have, Instinctive Tactics. So I'll still have really easy surges that are far easier than Fleeting Primacy. So, it does give me primacy, but I've got better hybrids, so I'll get rid of that. And now I just need to trim 3 end phase objectives. Let's look at things. Absolute Stillness is still really good, but is quite card dependent. So that's something I'll keep in mind for now. I'm definitely going to keep the Great Plan because my deck is built around it. The Will of the Slan isn't a dual or hybrid, but it's 2 glory, which is pretty easy for me, especially if I'm going last in a round. Dominant Position, super easy, have to take. Underdog is a hybrid, and because it has the primacy wording in it, I technically unlock primacy, which is good for me. Then I've got Great Gains and Path to Victory. So I think I'll probably get out Great Gains first, just because personally I probably would keep Great Gains for myself. But in general, if I wanted a more consistent deck, I would see how comfortable I was with it. And then if the Glory Train is really consistent, then I'd probably go in Great Gains. But for now, let's remove Great Gains. So now I need to pick 2 more to remove. First one I think I'll pick is probably Path to Victory. Absolute Stillness is still quite difficult, but Path to Victory can kind of brick more if I don't get a kill off. And especially if Clacktrock is killed early or I keep missing, I'll drop that for now. Because I've still got Bold Conquest and stuff, and even though I'm not getting too many objectives off of killing, I've got objectives that are slanted towards me, rewarding me for playing aggressively. So let's get rid of Path to Victory. Now that's brought me down to 5 jewels. So ignoring the Great Plan, I have 4 jewels and 4 hybrids. So I need to keep that in mind. But I need to get rid of 1 more objective. Now this is really difficult. You could go, I could get rid of the Will of the Slan, Absolute Stillness, Clean Kills, or Dominant Position. So Dominant Position and Will of the Slan are probably, if you look at it, highly likely to go because they're jewels. But I've got 5 jewels already. Technically 4 because of the Great Plan, but I only need to score 1. So I think I'll get rid of Absolute Stillness. Now that puts me at 12, but I'll keep those cards in mind, the same with Great Gains. So if I have enough testing and go, oh, you know what, I'm getting quarries quite consistently in terms of my upgrades, and I have enough push cards to stay on objectives. Because even if I can't, one of the big things about Absolute Stillness, I can't score it round 1, unless I'm really lucky. But generally, I can score rounds 2 and 3. But I can score everything else at any time. So with this deck, for my objectives, I'm pretty happy so far. So now I'll just move on to Gambits, then upgrades. So now we come to Gambits. Now with Gambits, you have to remember the 2 parts of Gambits. Gambit Ploys, which are your ploy cards, and Gambit Spells, which are your magical spells. The good thing about this Warband, they have no wizard, so I can ignore that. But it's an important part to mention now, because spells are still Gambits, so you can only have 10 Gambits, well, half your Gambits for half your upgrades. But Gambit spells still count as the space. So you can't basically have 10 Gambits and 10 ploy, or 10 spells and 10 ploys. So if you're going magic focused, you kind of have to find the right mix of how many spells you take to how many ploys. So you could take 10 spells and no ploys, but it's something you have to figure out yourself. But for this deck, just Gambits. First one's pretty simple. Burst from the shadows, choose up to 2 friendly hunters, and push each chosen fighter up to 2 hexes. So you can play this on your skinks, but the important thing is, if you can somehow give the hunter keyword to your leader and Clacktrock, that basically means you can push them up to 2 hexes as well. So this is a super flexible card that I can use to get into position for aggro, as well as to hold objectives. Very useful. Next is Huanqi's Device. It's basically a faction distraction, or my opponent chooses up to 3 of their own fighters and pushes them 1 hex. So I can use it aggressively just to push a single fighter, or if my opponent is on 3 or more objectives, I can play this and basically destroy their end phase. Useful and flexible, very strong. Next is Lords in Space of Time. It's kind of like a teleportation card. So I choose a friendly fighter not adjacent to enemy fighters and place them in the same hex as an objective token in enemy territory that isn't adjacent to enemy fighters, then give a move token. The important thing is I can play this after a fighter has charged. So I can charge with someone and redeploy onto an objective. Or I can play it in an opponent's power step after their activation to guarantee and inspire while I was making a safe redeploy. It's really strong. Next, I've taken the Great Drake, which is an asterism card. Now, this is a special Gambit archetypal card for the Starblood Stalkers, but it basically means you can only have 1 asterism in card, one asterism card in play at a time, and they persist for the round. So this gives +1 dice to range 1 attack actions for friendly fighters. So this is +1 dice for the round. So I can play this at the start of the round and put insane aggro pressure on the opponent, and it stacks on all my range 1 attack actions, so it's awesome. Next, I've taken Buried Instinct from Beastgrave. It's a reaction, and it basically, once I'm the target of an attack action, I can go on guard and get a guard token. And if that friendly fighter is a quarry, I can reroll 1 defense dice. So if I use this on Ottapatl, I get to reroll a defense dice too, and it's a reaction, so then it helps toward instinctive tactics. So super good for staying on objectives and synergizing with my other faction objectives. Next, I have Restless Prize. Now, this is another restricted card, so I've got 1 slot left, but it's something essential to any hold objective deck. It lets me push an objective hex up to 2 hexes, so I can use it to bring an objective closer, bring it from underneath an enemy fighter, and it's just really flexible and allows me to stay on objectives. And it's really hard to counter because it pushes 2. So even if someone pushes me off an objective, or I push their objective 2 hexes away from them, they have to play this card to counter it. So super strong. Then distraction, because I get to push an enemy fighter. Super strong for staying on objectives, as well as picking who I want to attack when I'm being aggressive. So next I have Outrun Death. So it's choose a fighter and they're a quarry and they have +2 movement for the round. So this is really awesome, and I've taken it over Spectral Wings because it makes me a quarry. It helps me with gathered momentum, but being a quarry is really cool, and it persists for the round. So if someone pushes my fighter or can somehow stall them for a power step, there'll still be +2 movement for the rest of the round. So it's really strong. Now I've added Symbiote's Call from the Silent Menace Universal deck. Now this is still from Diachasm, but the cool thing about this is I pick a feature token within 1 hex of a friendly fighter. I either flip it or push a fighter 1 hex towards it, so they're in the same hex. So it's basically a sidestep for objectives, but because in Diachasm there's a lot of Feed the Beastgrave decks that are floating around, so people are trying to flip objectives, at least this way I can save an objective I want to be on, and if I'm not running against the Feed the Beastgrave deck or someone running flip cards, I can just use it as a sidestep as well. So this is more of a tech card, but something to highlight now because it's interesting, especially for hold objective players. Then we've got Duel of Wits, super good, draw 2 cards, it's a reaction, helps with instinctive tactics. I've still got hold objective stuff, so I kind of need more cards to have a presence in case I get countered, to have more tools to stay on objectives. So this helps me in so many ways, and it's an essential take for this deck. So if we just look at my Gambits now, I've got 10. So I think I'm actually happy with this. The only thing I would probably like to add is punching up, but I'll see. It depends how much usage I'm making out of my skinks and how many attack action upgrades I take. But at the moment, I've got Buried Instinct, which helps me stay on objectives and score instinctive tactics. Restless Supplies for objectives again. Distraction for objectives again. Again, Burst of the Shadows for aggro and hold objectives. Same with Huanchi's Device and Lord of Space and Time. Then the Great Drake is my aggro card. So is Outrun Death, basically, for Clacktrock. And then Symbiote's Call is for hold objectives. And Duel of Wits just boosts the entire deck. So now let's go on to upgrades. So first things is Heaven Blessed Weapon. It's +1 dice and knockback 1 to range 1 attack actions. And it's clearly for Clacktrock. But I can put it on any fighter. So if I'm stacking attack action upgrades, it's actually pretty useful. Although you mainly want it on Clacktrock for his Celestine Maul. Now I've added Herald of the Old Ones. If this friendly fighter is within 3 hexes of a skink, and the target of an attack action, you can reroll 1 defense dice. So it's only for your leader, but this is the cool thing you can do with the Starblood Stalkers. What I kind of like about them is you can make the leader, Kizitaka, with a buff piece to defend himself and also the rest of the Warband. So I put this on Kizitaka, so Kizitaka either gets to reroll defense dice for itself or another friendly skink within 3 hexes. It's not a reaction, but the cool thing is most of these fighters get 2 more defense, especially when inspired, or even if they're 1 block, I get to reroll that block. So it's very useful, and I like it in this kind of deck because it rewards like pushing up and then having Kizitaka nearby with that push to help make my fighters more durable. Next is Spawning Bond. So it's a reaction. After another friendly skink is pushed within 3 hexes, push this fighter 1 hex, and it can only go on skinks. So the cool thing is here, if I trigger Skittish, I can then push this fighter, and I can push him in any direction. But even when my opponent pushes a skink and they're within 3 hexes of this equipped fighter, then I can push this fighter as well. So it's actually very flexible. It takes a lot of skill to use well, but that's something I want in this deck. Unfeeling Resilience is basically -1 damage negation permanently to a minimum of 1. Obviously I can put this on Clacktrock, but the cool thing is I can put it on any fighter in the Warband. And it just helps with their fragility. So, an auto include because I'm going to be aggressive, and even when I get punched in the face on objectives, I can still live. Unhesitating is my movement card I'm adding for this deck. So it's +1 move normally, +2 if they're a skink. So if I put in a skink, they're movement 6 or 7 when inspired. But Clacktrock will just be movement 4 or movement 5 inspired. So either way, it will synergize with gathered momentum while increasing my threat range. Now for my third restricted card, I've put on Cryptic Companion. So this makes me a quarry, and if that fighter is holding an objective at the end of the action phase, I gain 1 glory. So once again, it helps offset my glory bleeding by being a 6-fighter warband, but also allows me extra glory outside of my objective deck, which is hugely important because the only other way I could gain glory is via kills. and then it also makes me a quarry. It's my last restricted card, but exceedingly worth it, especially if you have the space as a hold objective player. Next, I've added Savage Strength. I want more aggro and more damage. The downside here is it's +1 damage, but -1 defense, and I have a lot of fighters with 2 or more defense. So I have to keep in mind when I equip it, but you know, Clacktrock Uninspired would be nice with this, but you know, I wouldn't really want to put on Clacktrock. But if I put it on Huanchi, or I put it on Zepik, then I get a nice boost from that because they only have a 1 defense. So I'll hold on to that for now. Next, I've added Soundless Step. So after this fighter's activation, push them 1 hex. It's better than Duelist Speed because I can use it after any activation, so I can go on guard or move. So it lets me stay on objectives better, but I can use it as a dance around effect, so I could charge someone, shoot them, and then push onto an objective. So it's really useful. Then I have Great Fortitude from the Essentials pack because, you know, it's +1 wounds. Really need it. Same with Great Strength, +1 damage with no real downside. Awesome. I've also taken the Guardian Glaive, so it's range 2, 2 dice, 2 damage, but if I'm holding an objective when attacking, I can reroll any and all attack dice, so it becomes even more accurate with good reach and decent damage output. I've also taken Soul Tooth Dagger. It's range 1, Free Fury, 2 damage. If I roll a crit, I do +1 damage, which is the best thing ever, but I get to reroll 1 dice against a fighter with a move or charge token, so it becomes even more likely that I can roll that crit, and it just becomes really accurate. It also makes this fighter a hunter, which is really useful too. And then I've also added Quickening Greaves. If you've got any kind of hold objective card or deck, this is essential because it's a push at either the start or the end of the round to stay on an objective, because it's an out of sequence push which no one can really stop. So it's great for securing an objective, especially if you've equipped that fighter with Cryptic Companion. And it can catch people off guard as well if you equip it in the end, well, in the last activation before the end phase. Really good. And then I've also got Glory Seeker because it's +1 damage against the fighter with 4 more wounds, and generally everyone has 4 more wounds, but it works on any range, so I could put on Ottopatl or even my leader, and it would affect their range-free attack actions. So really good. Alright, so now we've kind of come to a big problem. I have 14 upgrades, so technically this deck is legal because you can have as many upgrades as you want. But I want my deck to be 10 Gambits and 10 upgrades for my power deck. So I need to trim that. So let's look. I think the fairly obvious one is Savage Strength, because even though it's really good, that -1 defense really harms like Clacktrock and my leader if I put it on them, or even Tok. So let's just remove that. So I'm down to 13. So I need to trim 3. I think I'm going to keep Glory Seeker, Great Fortitude, and Great Strength because those are really good. I want to drop one of my attack action upgrades, so let's get rid of Guardian Glaive for now, because I think Soul Tooth Dagger is just more accurate and more damaging. So now I've got 12. I need to drop 2. So the question is, do I drop Unhesitating, Unfeeling, Resistant Spawning Bond, or Herald of the Old Ones? Let's get rid of Herald of the Old Ones for now, even though I like that reroll. Just not essential. I need the other upgrades because they give me so much. And then I could be greedy and go just for my Gambits, increase that to 11, or even keep it how it is now and have a 21 card deck. Could add more card draw and stuff like that. But I want to trim it down a bit more. So even though I love Spawning Bond so much, I think I'm going to get rid of it. Because it is a reaction, but so is Soundless Step. And, well, it's too situational. Even though I love it, it doesn't really synergize with what I want to do. It needs too much usage from the opponent. So let's just get rid of Spawning Bond. There we go. So I'm down to 10 and 10. And I think that's a really tight deck. So what I'll do is I'll save it. And if you want, I'll put in the episode description. And then what I do is I'd test it out. And then if I was happy with it, I'd leave it as is. But then I can always come and tinker with it. So when I tinker with decks, I actually usually rebuild them again. But that's something you can do yourself. Or you can just add and change. But even if I'm building the deck exactly the same, I usually just rebuild it. Because I find if I rebuild it again, if I've picked the same cards, then I'll go, okay, everything's fine. But if I've made it slightly differently, I can go, why have I picked those different cards? And it may be just because of how I've played with the deck. So if I'm not happy with any of these upgrades, gambits, or objectives, I can swap them around. For example, if I think, you know, my Glory Train is actually really consistent, I may drop one of my end phases to get in Great Gains or even Path to Victory. Or if I think I've got actually enough Quarry cards to give me the Quarry keyword, I can get Absolute Stillness, you know. It depends on how I play. Because I could drop Will of the Slan for Absolute Stillness or something like that. Or even Clean Kills. I go, you know, I'm too killy. Let me drop it for something else. Well, this is a good example. It's a fairly solid deck. So when I'm building a deck, I aim for the glory to be anywhere from 17 to 19, and that's a good average for me. So the cool thing about this deck, this is 18 glory, but technically clean kills would be 2 kills. So that's, even though it's 2 glory, it's a 4 glory card. So already that's pushed my glory up to 20. Everything else doesn't need kills to function, so that's very good. But then if you look at my upgrades, I have Cryptic Companion. So if I score Cryptic Companion every turn, that's pushed my glory ceiling up to 23 if I only get 2 kills minimum and I score my deck. But even then, if I don't, it's pushed it to 21 to 23. And that's really cool. So when you get into higher level deck building, in general, you'll kind of look for ways to get more glory outside of your deck. And the key thing to note is if you're playing as aggro, your glory total is probably going to be lower, but that's because any objective that requires a kill to function is technically worth 1 more than they are printed. For example, if a surge rewards you for killing an enemy fighter and gives you 1 glory, that's technically 2 glory because it's 1 for the kill, 1 for the objective. And then it's just calculating that up because you're going to get more glory outside of the deck. And obviously my deck's going to do a lot of killing because my Warband is very killy itself. And I've got enough cards to take into that. One thing I'm worried about is not having enough attack action upgrades to make my fighters a threat. So I may end up dropping one of my upgrades for Guardian's Glaive just to make more of my skinks a threat. But I just really like Soultooth Dagger because it can burst into 3 damage. And I've got that nice buff from the Great Drake, and it's pretty good. Or I could drop my Heaven Blessed Weapon for more attack action upgrades. But it's just something to keep in mind. I could also keep in mind to add like Scavenged Armor for Clacktrock when he's charging into enemy territory. But what I'd recommend in that case is if you've got cards that haven't met the cut, either make a separate deck with just like a draft name to add those cards in, or write them down in whatever way you want. And then you go, you know what? Let me experiment by swapping those cards in. And you could just even keep them in your deck box when you're transporting your deck separately and go, you know what? I've played it with this one. Let me swap it around and play around. But that's something you can do. And what I like to do when I make alterations to the deck, I'll save that as a different version. That's what my friends do when they play their card games. And don't be surprised if you make tons of changes, because I think for my main deck, some of them I've gone through like 20, 30 changes, like different additions. So don't be scared to experiment. But this is a good basis to go from, and I hope it makes sense. So yeah, there you have it. That's my guide to deck building in Warhammer Underworlds. As always, this will be time-stamped, so you can find out which section to jump to. But this is how I approach deck building, and I think it's the best way to do it, because it makes you realize it's not just the cards, it's the warband and playstyle that matters too. And you really need to understand your deck. You can't just add cards for the sake of it because you think they're good. They have to have a reason. And generally, most of the cards I add to any deck I play, they have 2 to 3 or even more uses in that deck and not just one. So it's something to keep in mind. If you want more help from me on deck building in general, feel free to add a comment or check out the episode description, because I've got a podcast which goes in depth into deck building as well as the article as well. So hopefully this all made sense. But if you're a new player and you want another summary, just think of your objective deck as how you want to achieve your goals in the game. They're your missions you need to score because they give you the glory to win the game. Then think of your power deck as more of your army list, wargear upgrades and special rules you can get, or even stratagems, because they give you special abilities and upgrades to make your fighters better, as well as do things they don't normally do or boost their abilities to function. And feel free to experiment. Even if I'm super comfortable with the deck, I generally tinker around in playing it in a different way, because playing a deck differently can drastically affect how you use cards, or just swapping cards out. But the trick is try not to make it tailored to a specific opponent, and just try and make it good at taking on all opponents. But you should always keep room in your deck for certain tech cards, as in cards you're taking for a specific reason if you have the space, as long as they don't harm the overall efficiency of a deck. For example, in the deck I talked about Symbiote's Call. So generally it's just a sidestep that I can only play next to an objective, but if I'm running into someone who's running flip tech, I can use it to counter that and keep me an objective that's safe to use. So it's always something to keep in mind. Tech cards are really useful, but never run tech cards at the point of the detriment of your own deck, because if you don't run into that matchup and that tech card is useless, it's eating up an essential slot in your deck. And then finally, always use a deck builder. Just always, even if you're really stubborn. What I do is I write out my deck and then I copy it onto my phone, and then I also have it on the deck builder. So I have two sources of it, but then like the deck builder is just where I go and have fun and just, store the deck and tinker from there. Another good thing is asking your friends for advice, or even people online. And I've already covered that in the podcast, but it's really good getting another person's opinion on your deck, because you may not be able to see the flaws of it, even if you've played it, until someone else points it out to you. So that's really good. And remember, practice is the key thing here, because even if a deck may look perfect on paper, it may not translate the same when you're playing games. Because ideally, you want a deck to work consistently 90% or even more of the time. You don't want it to fail at all. And you may actually tinker cards because, I get a lot of glory from this card, but it causes my deck to brick too much. So I'll take a lower scoring card, but it increases the overall efficiency of my deck. But that's something you can only get through playing. But yeah, that's pretty much it for deck building. As always, remember to like and subscribe, as well as to comment in the episode description below as to what you thought of today's video and if it's been of any help. And as always, if you have any more questions about deck building, I'll always be happy to ask. And yeah, remember to check out the articles in the episode description, because I'll probably update the article eventually, but as of now, the video is the most up-to-date source. The other useful tips, as I said before, would be the podcast where I talked about deck building with David Smee. And yeah, it should be great for new and old players alike. So remember, even when deck building in Warhammer Underworlds, you can never underestimate the power of crits.